is one book, of which it might be affirmed and argued that it were better for humanity to keep this one and lose all others than to lose this, and to keep all else bequeathed by human genius to all that we shall know of posterity. More is connoted by the word Shakespeare than that of any man who walked the earth. Algernon Charles Swinburne.
There is actually a kind of sacredness in the fact of such a man being sent to this earth. Thomas Carlyle. Look you, the good God naturally has a right to the first place, but the second certainly belongs to Shakespeare. Heinrich Heine.
The life of Shakespeare is a fine mystery. It's a great comfort, to my way of thinking, that so little is known concerning the poet. I tremble every day lest something should turn up. Charles Dickens. I am one of those Brontosaurians, in that I don't know who did write the plays, but I am quite composedly and contentedly sure that the Stratford man didn't. Mark Twain. I'm sort of haunted by the conviction that the divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced upon a patient world. Henry James. I no longer believe that William Shakespeare is the author of the plays and poems that have for so long been attributed to him. He has almost nothing to support his claim. It almost irritates me that you should support the notion. Sigmund Freud. The life of Shakespeare is a fine mystery, fine mystery. My dear Watson, how many times have I told you that whenever you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth? There is a problem. There is a mystery. There may be a crime. A mystery so compelling it has drawn your humble servant down from his posthumous perch in Victorian Valhalla to the lecture platform to unravel it. There are those to whom our quest is an affront, to whom the question of the authorship of the world's greatest plays and poems is a case forever closed in the person of their beloved Bard of Avon. To them, may I say, we all love our Shakespeare. To confront this great mystery frankly, to admit with Hamlet that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy, can only deepen that love, can only make us search more deeply into the great work itself, that eternal mirror of our souls. Besides, the question won't go away. We may bury our heads deep in Stratford's sweet soil, but the roots of this great mystery cannot be ignored. There are too many uncomfortable facts, and too many strange coincidences. After 400 years, the mystery still persists. Who is the true author of the plays and poems that have come down to us under the name William Shakespeare? Good day to you. My name is Sherlock Holmes. As my good chronicler, Dr. Watson, has made clear to succeeding generations, I have ever craved intellectual stimulation above all else. And I challenge you to find a more compelling mystery than this one, or a worthier subject. Given a universe of intellectual questions, the Shakespeare mystery compels my attention, as I believe it will yours. So then, How did it begin? This mystery began almost 3 centuries ago, as those who loved the Shakespeare plays and poems, seeking to learn more about this extraordinary genius, found that where they expected to find one Shakespeare, there were 2. Shakespeare number 1 is the man revealed in the amazing work. The man whose phrases run through the brains of every one of us. A man of astonishing depth and range of knowledge and an unforgettable way with words. Shakespeare number 2 is the uneducated actor from Stratford-on-Avon. Is a very contrasting fellow indeed. One may peruse the plays quite deeply, and there is a controversy in our question, but read the plays and poems and you will have to conclude, first of all, that Shakespeare had the largest vocabulary of any writer who ever lived. Most educated people today make do with about 3,000 words. A first-rate author will use about 8,000. Shakespeare's vocabulary has been conservatively estimated at 20,000 words. 70 to 200 of which he used only once and never again, 3,000 of which he invented. One of them, by the way, he coined the word meditation. Legal scholar. Shakespeare's range of legal knowledge was so deep that the great legal masters of 3 succeeding centuries regarded him as their peer and equal. He uses legal phrases and allusions throughout the plays, never incorrectly. That he was a scholar in ancient languages, Latin and Greek, as well as being fluent in Italian and French. That he had been to sea and knew firsthand the nautical terms, which he never uses incorrectly, as experts have testified. That he was deeply familiar with the ways of the royal court of Queen Elizabeth and of the aristocracy in general. Well-versed in medicine and medical terms, showing almost a doctor's knowledge of disease and anatomy, with a keen understanding of morbid psychology and the various degrees of mental illness. A sportsman who reveled in the games of the aristocracy, such as fox hunting, falconry, and archery. Falconry in particular, in Shakespeare's day, was a fading sport practiced exclusively by the nobility. And yet he knew its many arcane terms perfectly, and the imagery of falconry is everywhere in his plays. He was a widely traveled man who knew firsthand the topography of France and northern Italy. He was, in fact, an enthusiast for all things Italian. Dismissive of money matters and careless of his finances, a classically aristocratic attitude that one finds throughout his work. Finally, we know that his work was famous in his own times, that Queen Elizabeth and her successor King James delighted in his plays, that his epic poems were what we would call bestsellers in their day. And so, naturally, we should expect to find, as we do for other writers of his day, written references from the time that identify him personally as the author of these works. Letters to him by others. Letters by him to others, letters about him between others, a written record of financial transactions, etc. In short, a written record of a living, breathing writer, known personally as such to his contemporaries. And of course, we should expect to find evidence that so profoundly learned a man must have owned a large private library. Such is the Shakespeare we must expect to find, given the evidence of his immortal works. So then, now we come to it. Shakespeare, number 2, The Origin of Doubt and Mystery, the man from Stratford-on-Avon. 4 centuries worth of diligent search by an army of scholars has revealed the following. No one has ever found authentic writing of any sort by the man known to his neighbours as William Shakespeare, beyond 6 wobbly signatures affixed to legal documents, none of which is related to plays, poetry, or publishing. For all anybody knows and can prove, this man never wrote a play in his life. For all anybody knows and can prove, this man never wrote a letter in his life. Handwriting experts have questioned whether he could write at all. In his last will and testament, a very tidy document drawn up by a law clerk, he notes his every possession down to his second best bed, which he famously left to his wife, Anne. He mentions not a single book, not a single unpublished manuscript, not a single paper. This in an age when books might cost what an automobile would today. A diligent search of every town for 50 miles around by a Shakespeare-loving cleric a generation later could not turn up a single book owned by the Stratford man, not even the family Bible. One can only conclude that he did not have a private library of any sort. Yes, strange but true, the man who supposedly wrote immortal works that show profound learning did not own a single book. There is no record indicating that Shakespeare of Stratford ever went to school a day in his life. He grew up in a nearly bookless town as the son of parents who could neither read nor write. For that matter, he never taught his children to read or write either. Try wrapping your minds around that. Shakespeare's children couldn't read. Parents, you may feel somewhat sympathetic. Whoever wrote these plays was a giant intellect. During the years in which such a brilliant young mind would be absorbing the range of knowledge shown in the plays, his biographers would have us believe that he had quit school and was working as a butcher's apprentice slaughtering calves. The question of how such a person could have acquired the aristocratic viewpoint of the plays, the largest vocabulary of all time, and all that learning struck reasonable persons as a mystery. During his lifetime, there is not one single reference to Shakespeare of Stratford as being in any way connected to playwriting, poetry, or publishing. No, beg pardon, there are actually 2 such references, both of which make fun of the notion that the Stratford man wrote the plays. His neighbours knew him only as a grain dealer, as in this sketch of the Stratford monument from the year 1630. Note that he is clutching what appears to be a sack of grain. But, lo and behold, 100 years later, as tradition now ascribed the great plays to him, and as the village of Stratford has a booming tourist trade, the grain dealer has become a great poet. The sack of sack of grain is a cushion, and he holds a quill pen. Rather a mystery. But he was famous, yes, well, no, not really. The name Shakespeare was famous, as the name printed on the published poems and plays. We have many written instances of praise of the poet Shakespeare, spelled, by the way, with the rarely used hyphen, often indicating a pen name. But none of the references to Shakespeare, the poet and playwright, during his lifetime identify him in any way as being the man from Stratford on Avon. In fact, at the height of Shakespeare's fame, we find that Will Shakespeare of Stratford was so unknown that London tax collectors, for a number of years, had to give up on making him pay his taxes because they couldn't find him. Address unknown. A mystery. But surely his fellow actors and writers knew him. All those charming folk we met in Shakespeare in Love, remember? Ah, yes. Philip Henzer. The fellow with his feet in the fire at the opening of the film, played by Geoffrey Rush. Producer theatre owner, the Michael Eisner of his day, if you will. He kept a detailed diary, and we still have it. He recorded actors he hired, playwrights he paid, plays he purchased over a period of 13 years at the height of Shakespeare's career. He doesn't mention Will Shakespeare of Stratford even once. Oh, he mentions the Shakespeare plays, all right. He produced a number of them. But unlike the entries for other plays he records by other writers where he lists the playwright's name, when it comes to the Shakespeare plays, no author's name is written. Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, blank. A mystery. Or take the Ben Affleck character, Edward Allen, the Tom Cruise of the 1590s. Yes, there he is. Styles change. He too kept a diary that survives today. He too owned a theatre. He too produced Shakespeare's plays. And he too doesn't mention Will Shakespeare of Stratford even once. Curiouser and curiouser. Now, all this is very interesting. But what does it mean? After all, nobody doubts that Dickens wrote the works of Dickens, or that Beethoven composed the symphonies, or that John Milton wrote Paradise Lost. But that is because we have plentiful references from the time by their contemporaries that verify the tradition of their authorship and conclusive documentary proof, what literary biographers call primary evidence. When it comes to Shakespeare, the contemporary record is a blank. Not just sketchy, mind you, but a total blank. It is as if someone set out to erase all written records that would link the works of Shakespeare to any living person. Now that is hard to believe, I grant you. But it is so. And oh, by the way, one other thing. The Elizabethans loved poetry, and they loved poets. When a great poet died, there was always a public outpouring of grief, and all the other poets would compete with each other in writing flowery tributes to the deceased. Sir Philip Sidney, for example, would have a funeral of near royal proportions. But when Will Shakespeare of Stratford, supposedly the greatest and most beloved of them all, died in 1616, it was a non-event. No eulogies, no public outcry for a burial at Westminster Abbey. Nobody noticed. One can only suppose that nobody who knew him connected him in any way with the great poet. Back to our mystery. If Will Shakespeare of Stratford did not write the plays, then who did? And why would this person's authorship be concealed? To answer this question, we must enter a vanished world. The world of England under Queen Elizabeth I. A world strange to our 21st century minds. A world governed by rigid class distinctions. A world ruled by an autocratic queen in a time of bloody upheaval, when torture by the rack was as commonly used as the lie detector is today. It was a world of omnipresent spies and intrigue, when political power lay in the hands of the titled aristocracy and God's anointed monarch, lightly constrained by Parliament. It was a world in which the great majority of people could neither read nor write. A world only a few brief generations removed from the invention of the printing press. A world in which a fine book might cost what an automobile would today. A world which knew nothing of newspapers or a free press. A world in which a devoted subject of the Queen would have his hand chopped off for the crime of having suggested in print that she not marry a foreigner. And still he cried, "God save the Queen," after the axe fell, before he fainted from loss of blood. It was a world ruled by an aristocracy which glorified war and held writers in low esteem and viewed the theatre with disdain. Yet, the heady winds of the Renaissance were blowing in from Europe, touching England late in their journey, for it was also a time when the theatre flourished as never before, and the English language grew into an instrument of unrivaled range and subtlety, inspired by Elizabeth herself. A woman of brilliant wit and profound learning, who adored poetry, adored poets, and was addicted to plays. At the court of Elizabeth I, to be a brilliant poet was to win her favor, and to win her favor was to win riches, influence, power. For our purpose, above all, it was a world in which a nobleman would never allow it to be publicly known that he was the author of published poetry, let alone that he wrote plays for the common stage. To write for the Queen was one thing, but to peddle your words in print like a common tradesman, unthinkable. Such a thing would be utterly beneath the dignity of an English lord. It would bring shame upon his family name, his title, and on aristocracy itself. And yet, we know that under Elizabeth, noblemen did write poetry. Noblemen did write plays. In the year 1589, George Puttenham would write that poets were subject to scorn and derision, and that noblemen who did write poetry suppressed it or suffered it to be published without their own names to it, as if it were a discredit for a gentleman to seem learned. It is in this vanished world that we must look, in our search for one of the greatest human beings who ever lived. Now, there are those who ask, at this point, who cares? What does it matter? We have the great plays and poems, and whoever wrote them has been dead for over 4 centuries. What does it matter who Shakespeare was? To this, one can only answer that if it doesn't matter who Shakespeare was, then it doesn't matter who anyone was. Gautama Buddha, Julius Caesar, Jesus Christ, Joan of Arc, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Albert Einstein, and every other pinnacle of human greatness who has inspired the world topples into dusty irrelevance. Who cares? We all care. You care. Because if it doesn't matter who Shakespeare was, then it doesn't matter who anyone was. It doesn't matter who you are. Truth matters. Art matters. The struggle to create matters. The man who gave us this great gift deserves to be known and honored. We owe him that. So then, who was he? 200 years ago, educated, sensible people who couldn't accept the Stratford man as Shakespeare began to look for the true author. In the early years of the 19th century, a promising candidate was identified. In looking for a man of Shakespeare's day who possessed the nearly universal knowledge displayed in the works, the skeptics hit upon the great philosopher Sir Francis Bacon. An intimate of the royal court under both Elizabeth and James, a great statesman and diplomat, he was also a spy master who was expert at the art of encoding messages for secret communication. Believing that Bacon had cleverly revealed his authorship through hidden messages encoded in the plays, leading Baconians, as they were called, spent lifetimes poring over every syllable in Shakespeare, attempting to unlock the secret code they were certain would reveal to the world the true author. Here is one example of their efforts. They never found it. Other candidates were proposed, Another character from Shakespeare in Love, the playwright Christopher Marlowe. A brilliant mind, highly educated at Cambridge University, and the author of several fine plays under his own name. At his best, he was capable of turning out verse not only on a level with Shakespeare, but markedly similar to it. Sadly, however, he was stabbed through the eye in a drunken brawl at age 29 in the year 1593, when many of the Shakespeare plays are supposed to have not yet been written. But Marlowe theorists, or Marlovians as they style themselves, suggest that he didn't really die, but faked his death in order to avoid torture. He had been charged with heresy and homosexuality, and he was spirited out of the country by his lover, Thomas Walsingham, cousin of the Queen's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, played here in the film Elizabeth by our old friend Geoffrey Rush. He then wrote the plays from abroad, according to the theory, and sent them back to England under the pen name Shakespeare, which first appeared in print a few months later. An interesting theory, and not so far-fetched as it might seem. Faking one's death was an old spy trick, even in those days. But it still leaves us in the Elvis lives category of bootless speculation. No. We need greater proof in our mystery than simply to say Marlowe has left the building. And indeed, it is in this wacky territory that those in quest of the true Shakespeare soon found themselves. One candidate after another came forward until the field was crowded with Shakespeare wannabes, as your current idiom has it. The Earl of Derby, the Earl of Pembroke, Mary Sidney, sister of the poet Philip Sidney, even the Queen herself. And of course, the academic authorities clung to old Will Shakespeare of Stratford, despite the growing chorus of doubt from eminent writers and thinkers. And who could blame them? In the absence of a truly convincing alternative, one could hardly expect to overturn a 400-year-old tradition, however dubious its origins. It seemed as if the mystery of Shakespeare would reverberate down to the last days of history, as if these immortal plays were indeed simply a gift from heaven, dropped down out of the blue, the work of no human hand. And then, in the year 1920, an English schoolmaster named Thomas Loney set out to do what no one, curiously enough, had before attempted. Unable to accept the Stratford theory, having taught the plays to a generation of students, he set out with no preconceived notion of his own to search for the true Shakespeare systematically and with a completely open mind. He approached it, in fact, rather as your humble servant would do in attempting to solve a mysterious crime. We must, he said, free the problem from illogical entanglements and miraculous assumptions, and look for scientific relationship between cause and effect. The common sense method is simply to examine closely the work itself, to draw from the examination as definite a conception as possible of the man who did it, to form some idea of where he would be likely to be found, and then to go and look for a man who answers the supposed description. One may quibble, of course, over the traits deduced from the works by our professor, but they do not stray afield from common sense. In looking for our man, Professor Loney supposed that, 1, he would be an intimate of the court and of the high nobility. This, of course, is the most persuasive reason such a man would have to hide his identity. As we have seen, noblemen could not be seen to write plays for the common stage. It simply wasn't done. Yet the plays are infused throughout with the aristocratic viewpoint. Point 2, that he would be a recognized genius, but mysterious, with a record of wasted talent. That he would be an apparent eccentric, Possessing as he did one of the most sensitive and multifaceted personalities of all time, at once as solemn as Hamlet and as fun-loving as Falstaff. Of pronounced and known literary tastes, with an absorbing interest in the classics and English history, and an enthusiast for the drama, reasonable enough, of superior education and legal training. One doesn't acquire a 20,000-word vocabulary and that depth of legal knowledge by cramming for a day or two before dashing off a play. An enthusiast for Italy. The plays swarm with Italian settings and characters theretofore unknown in the English drama, and some are drawn from Italian sources that were not yet translated into English. Our man must have spoken Italian. Of feudal connections and Lancastrian associations in the War of the Roses of the higher aristocracy, as can be deduced from the plays. An accomplished sportsman, as we have seen, falconry, jousting, and swordsmanship are ever ready to hand for our mysterious bard. Loose and improvident in money matters. Shakespeare's scorn for money-making and hoarding, a classically aristocratic attitude, is seen throughout his work, and is particularly at odds with the record of Stratford's small claims court whiz, Will Shakespeare, who was always suing his neighbours for the recovery of petty sums. That he would be conflicted in his attitude towards women. A man who could create such female characters of such wit, heart, and verve as Cleopatra, Juliet, and Beatrice cannot but have respected their sex as equals. And yet, the sonnets are rife with distrust of woman, and phrases from the plays, such as "Frailty, thy name is woman," and "Get thee to a nunnery, go!" still echo down the ages. Having deduced these probable traits, our professor then catalogued all the leading candidates, as well as every prominent nobleman or writer of the time who might conceivably lay claim to the mantle of the bard. And quite unexpectedly, one man, theretofore unsuspected, stood out from all the rest, emerging from the mists of history to command the attention of unprejudiced minds. Point by point, the mysterious blanks of our story were filled in, revealing Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Professor Loney stumbled upon the discovery almost by chance when he came across an early sample of de Vere's poetry. Its similarity in style, content, and theme to the Shakespeare sonnets was remarkable. On further investigation, he found that de Vere was a widely praised court poet and playwright whose plays were mysteriously lost to history. As he pursued his search, 1,000 pieces fell rapidly into place, to wit, of the higher nobility and an intimate of the Queen's court, of no less noble blood than Elizabeth herself. De Vere was, in his youth, acknowledged to be her favourite courtier, and may have been, for a time, her lover. He married the daughter of her most trusted counsellor, Sir William Cecil Lord Burleigh, and in later years was given a mysteriously huge allowance by the notoriously tight-fisted Queen of £1,000 per year, a huge sum in those days, more than she paid for the running of the National Post Office. This secretly paid allowance was renewed by her successor King James, who called the Earl Great Oxford. As no accounting was required of de Vere for this enormous sum, one can only wonder what great service he performed for it. The wasted genius. De Vere was called by his contemporaries a preeminent writer, accounted the best for comedy at Elizabeth's court, the first among noblemen poets, said his contemporary George Puttenham, if their doings could be made known. His early lyric poetry under his own name showed great promise, but he fell mysteriously mute in later life, prompting Britain's national biography of Dictionary of Biography today to state that, quote, an unlifted shadow lies over his memory. The eccentric, a passing singular odd man, one contemporary called him. He was known both for his wide-ranging accomplishments as scholar, poet, and swordsman, and a mercurial nature, with a flashing temper, rather like Hamlet, indeed very much like Hamlet, as we shall discover. Pronounced and known literary tastes, with an absorbing interest in the classics and English history, a great patron of other writers, De Vere was from his infancy a prodigy in his absorption of classical literature. An enthusiast for the drama? To his family's consternation, De Vere consorted with writers and actors and sponsored a company of players. Evidence indicates that the Lord Chamberlain's men, known to history as Shakespeare's company, may have been under the guidance and patronage of Edward de Vere, who also held the hereditary title of Lord Great Chamberlain to the Queen. Of superior education and legal training, matriculating at Queen's College, Cambridge at the tender age of 9, he received a degree from Cambridge at the age of 12 and a Master of Arts from Oxford at 16. He was fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. He then studied law for several years at one of the Inns of Court, where young Englishmen still study law to this very day. An enthusiast for Italy, Edward de Vere was so well-travelled in Italy, including Venice, Padua, Florence, and Naples, and was so enamored of Italian dress and manners that on his return to England he was satirized as, quote, the Italian Earl. Of feudal connections and Lancastrian associations in the War of the Roses, tracing their lineage back 5 centuries to William the Conqueror, De Vere's ancestors supported the Lancaster cause in the War of the Roses, which is chronicled in Shakespeare's history plays in a way that plays up rather shamelessly the roles played by the Earls of Oxford. One of his family coats of arms, by the way, is of a lion shaking a spear. At the Queen's court he was praised as one, quote, whose countenance shakes spears. Does a pen name suggest itself? An accomplished sportsman, speaking of spears, he was a renowned swordsman and jouster and a frequent champion in the tournaments, and once, in Italy, challenged all comers to single combat for the honor of his queen. No one dared to take him up on it. Raised at his family's ancestral castle, he would have had ample opportunity to learn the aristocratic sports, such as falconry, whose imagery is everywhere in the plays. Loose and improvident in money matters, conflicted in his attitude towards women. Before being put forward as the true Shakespeare, Edward de Vere was chiefly remembered by his descendants as the black sheep of the family, mainly because he sold off much of their ancestral lands to pay his debts. Plagued by bad luck in his investments while generously patronizing other writers, de Vere was forever having to sell off more of his estates. He had what one may generously call a blithe attitude towards money. Which brings us to the question of his attitude towards women and reveals a series of coincidences between the Shakespeare plays and the life of Edward de Vere that can only be called astonishing. Whatever one's position on the authorship controversy may be, it has long been agreed that Shakespeare reveals himself most fully in the person of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, commonly regarded as the most fascinating character in all of fiction. The correspondences between the gloomy prince and our mysterious earl are striking indeed, and led Sigmund Freud, among others, to conclude that the latter created the former. For example, "Frailty, thy name is woman," Hamlet cries as the play opens. Hamlet's world has been poisoned by the sudden death of his father, King Hamlet, followed 1 month later by the sudden remarriage of his mother, Queen Gertrude, to his father's brother, Claudius, who takes advantage of Hamlet's absence at school to claim the throne. How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world, Hamlet tells us as the play opens. He is already contemplating suicide. And what of De Vere? Edward de Vere, too, lost his beloved father suddenly as a very young man, whereupon his mother remarried with unseemly haste, and his claims to his ancestral land were then split up between his mother's new husband and the man many have taken to be the historical model for Claudius, the cunning and ambitious Robert Dudley, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth's, seen here in the recent film. Neither a borrower nor a lender be. It has long been known since the day the play was written that the character of Polonius, the windy old word bag of a counsellor in Hamlet, whose fatherly advice we're all always hearing, was a blatant satire on Queen Elizabeth's most trusted counsellor, Sir William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. Polonius's famous fatherly advice is a parody of Burleigh's fatherly advice to his son Robert, which we have just quoted. Well, what of Edward de Vere? Well, there are significant problems here if you suppose that a lowly actor from the backwoods village of Stratford is daring to lampoon the Queen's Lord Treasurer on the public stage. Having his hand chopped off would probably be getting off easy. Stranger still, Burleigh's advice to his son Robert was not published until years after the play was written, begging the question of how a common actor could have had access to the private papers of Lord Burleigh, much less hope to get away with mocking him in a play performed for the court. Yet when Hamlet was published, it appeared with the royal coat of arms, the majestic seal of approval on the title page. Well, all these conflicts disappear if one looks to Edward de Vere as the playwright. For in sending up Lord Burleigh, de Vere was making fun of his father-in-law. Yes, that's right. For students of the play, in real life, Hamlet married Ophelia, just as mercurial Edward de Vere married sweet Anne Cecil, the naive daughter of court councillor Lord Burleigh. Being himself of the noblest family in England, and an intimate of the Queen's, only that fun-loving prankster de Vere could hope not only to get away with such a thing, but to have it winked at with the royal seal of approval. And of course, access to Burleigh's private papers, while easy for de Vere, is not even necessary, as Burleigh's typically preachy lecture was very likely a family joke. Oh, there goes Dad with that old neither a borrower nor a lender be speech again. And the parallels with Hamlet do not stop there. The most famous dramatic speech in history, to be or not to be, for some 200 years has been thought by scholars to be based on the book Cardanus' Comfort. The words touching on death and sleep are markedly similar, and its influence can be seen throughout the works. And as it happens, Cardanus' Comfort, translated from the Latin by one Thomas Bedingfield, was published in the year 1573 by the commandment of, and at the expense of, and with a dedication by, yes, the 17th Earl of Oxford, our friend Edward de Vere. Of course, Shakespeare of Stratford is unlikely to have read it, as he apparently did not own a book of any kind and was only 9 years old. And there's more. Hamlet's trusted friend is the even-tempered Horatio. De Vere relied upon his famously even-tempered cousin, also called Horatio. Hamlet is captured by pirates crossing the English Channel and is later released. De Vere was captured by pirates crossing the English Channel and was later released. Nor do the parallels between Earl and Bard end there. Time does not permit me to catalogue the some hundreds of further remarkable and specific coincidences between the works of Shakespeare and the life of Edward de Vere. But let us shed a brief ray of light on those mysterious sonnets. that intriguing and disturbing set of 154 intensely passionate masterpiece poems. The sonnets are dedicated to and celebrate the poet's friendship with the much admired Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. If the sonnet sequence, which is a subject of great scholarly debate, could be said to have a single unifying theme, all might agree that it is this: the supremacy and immortality of great art and of poetry. In sonnet after sonnet, the poet assures his beloved friend that he shall be immortalized in these verses, long after old age and death have had their way. And yet, no such immortality is promised to the poet himself. Indeed, quite the opposite. The poetry shall live forever, but the poet shall remain unknown, his identity buried. He makes this unmistakably clear in many places, such as Sonnet 81. Or I shall live your epitaph to make, or you survive when I in earth am rotten. From hence your memory death cannot take, although in me each part will be forgotten. Your name from hence immortal life shall have, though I, once gone, to all the world must die. The earth can yield me but a common grave, when you, entombed in men's eyes, shall lie. Your monument shall be my gentle verse, which eyes not yet created shall all read, and tongues to be your being shall rehearse. When all the breathers of this world are dead, you still shall live. Such virtue hath my pen, where breath most breathes, even in the mouths of men. Your name from hence immortal life shall have, though I once gone, to all the world must die. What can the poet mean? Except that he will be denied the credit for poems he knows will live forever. It's a recurring theme, for he says elsewhere, my name be buried where my body is, and live no more to shame, nor me nor you. Here can we doubt that a nobleman speaks, shamed into silence by his theatrical activities, but knowing, as a genius does, that his work is immortal. It is worth noting that 4 centuries of diligent search by an army of scholars has failed to come up with a single shred of evidence connecting Shakespeare of Stratford to the Earl of Southampton, to whom the poems are written and dedicated. As for De Vere, he knew Southampton well. His daughter Elizabeth very nearly became Southampton's wife. Let us leave the rarefied realms of the poetic and descend back to the hard ground of facts and logic. Our mystery is solved by certain postulates, each one based upon the one preceding, each one well-grounded in evidence. Postulate number 1. The works of Shakespeare were written by a highly educated nobleman. All the evidence supports this theory. It's not strictly impossible. They could have been written by a rustic actor. Human genius crops up everywhere. But the evidence does not support it, and it strains credulity to the breaking point. Postulate number 2. The nobleman used a pen name to conceal his authorship. As we have seen, social pressure of the day demanded this. Nobleman did not write poetry. It wasn't done. If postulate number 1 holds, postulate number 2 follows inevitably. Postulate number 3. A stand-in was needed. An actual person to point to as the author. A pen name is not disguise enough. So the plays were written under the pen name William Shakespeare. Well, who is he? Where is he? The disguise would not last unless it were embodied by a living person. The evidence indicates that sometime in the late 1590s, Will Shakespeare of Stratford, a low-level theatrical functionary with an apt name, was prevailed upon by the authorities to fill this role and paid off handsomely to return to Stratford. He bought the second-best house in town about this time, and to keep modestly reticent about his London doings, Given his modest education, the pseudonym would be penetrated too easily in London, where his lack of qualifications as a great poet would be too obvious. So back to Stratford he went, suddenly quite a wealthy man after a mere 8 years in London, and there, for the most part, he stayed, supposedly commuting up to London, a 3 days' journey, to write the plays, if you buy the Stratford theory. Postulate number 4. Elimination of the paper trail. This postulate is, on the surface, highly implausible. For the disguise to hold up for posterity, the following documents would have to vanish. All record of Will Shakespeare's education or lack of it, the Stratford school records. All specimens of handwriting by Shakespeare, supposing any existed. The Lord Chamberlain's records for Shakespeare's acting company during the period of the plays. All prompt books and financial transactions bearing on the plays. All documents of any kind in the poet's own handwriting that would betray his authorship, including original manuscripts, diaries, letters. Most of Edward de Vere's letters, except those saved by Lord Burleigh and his son to tell their version, have vanished. All written references by prominent people of the time who might be expected to have known the poet personally. Now I grant you, it is unlikely that all these documents could vanish without a trace. But the question of likelihood does not arise. It happened. All those documents are gone. It is the root of the Shakespeare mystery. It is why people are still asking who he was 4 centuries later. It's worth repeating that ample documentation exists from those years for far more obscure figures than the great bard. Despite the ensuing civil war, despite the Great Fire of London, documents survived, but not for Shakespeare. If we had those documents, I would not be standing here. But they are gone. Nor would it require a vast and improbable conspiracy to keep the authorship secret. In an autocratic monarchy, in an age of spies and torture, you don't need a conspiracy. Fear and central control work quite well enough. Lord Burleigh and his son Robert after him were uniquely placed in their almost total control of public records to cleanse the record. The play-going public? They were in the dark from the beginning, as the pen name Shakespeare was not attached to the plays until years after they were first performed. The tight circle of those in the know at court would not have wanted the secret known, and the small circle of actors and writers would not have dared to divulge it. De Vere was their patron, and not a man one would wish to offend. So, the nobleman wants to go slumming with theatrical types? Well and good. We'll have a grand old time with him. But never overstep that huge gulf of class distinction. No conspiracy is required. It simply isn't done. To sum up, look to Stratford and Shakespeare as a blank, an unacceptable void, an utter contradiction. Look to Edward de Vere, and our beloved poet is there in living, breathing reality, with 1,000 stories to tell. And when it came time to publish perhaps the greatest book of all time, the first folio collection of Shakespeare's plays, the expense was borne by Edward de Vere's son-in-law, the Earl of Montgomery, who would have had access to the manuscripts, and his brother, the Earl of Pembroke, who nearly married de Vere's other daughter, both known for their love of poetry and the theatre. They did their duty in maintaining the disguise, of course, and laid out the vague references to the Stratford man in the dedicatory addresses that are the basis of the Shakespeare tradition. But read those references carefully, my friends, and you may sense tongue planted firmly in cheek. You can almost sense them hoping that you won't buy the disguise, that you will penetrate the mystery and see the truth. Which brings us to one final mystery. Where are the manuscripts? At the beginning of our mystery, I hinted there may be a crime at the heart of it. Crime is my specialty, after all. though I will occasionally pursue an intriguing problem for the sheer fascination of it, as we do here, but crime there may be after all. One of the central features of the Shakespeare mystery, as we have seen, is that one of the most prolific writers who ever lived, whose work was adored by two successive monarchs in an age that prized poetry and poets, has left us not a single scrap of writing in his own hand. Not a letter, not a poem, not a play, not a grocery list. And even for a scrap of the poet's handwriting in today's market, the bidding would begin at 1 million of your American dollars. The price for the manuscripts themselves, they would be beyond price. To discover the Shakespeare manuscripts at this late date, after the greatest literary paper chase of all time, would dwarf the revelation of King Tut's tomb. Let's dare a hypothesis, shall we? Suppose you have the manuscripts in your hands. Suppose you know their worth, that the works are an immortal gift to mankind. Suppose you knew and loved the true author and wished to preserve his memory. Suppose that you are under an obligation to powerful authorities to forever erase that memory. Suppose further that you're a rather clever Elizabethan writer yourself, for whom double meanings and puns are as natural as breathing. Suppose, in other words, that you are Ben Jonson, who helped prepare the folio and who wrote the great tribute to Shakespeare that opens it. Could you bear to commit the enormous crime of destroying the original manuscripts, forever erasing the memory of your friend? And if you could not bring yourself to commit this crime, where would you hide them so that they would not be lost? To hide them forever would be as good as to burn them. So, if you choose to hide them, you must leave clues so that they will one day be found. One fine day, when all those fearful authorities are in the grave themselves, someone, you hope, some perceptive someone who senses a mystery here will look at your clever clues and think, hold on, now what does that mean? But how to get that someone's attention and where to hide the papers? If it were up to your humble servant, I should hide them in plain sight. And that, we may believe, is just what Ben Jonson may have done. Observe this monument. It stands in Trinity Church in Stratford-on-Avon in Warwickshire, England. Erected by unknown parties sometime between 1616 and 1623, its presumed purpose was to memorialize Will Shakespeare, known to his neighbors as a grain dealer and moneylender. But it must also serve a double purpose. It must also double as the memorial to a great poet and playwright, for those who follow up the first folio references and come up to Stratford to pay tribute. Now, if Shakespeare was indeed the poet, the simple thing would be for the monument to state it boldly: William Shakespeare, poet and playwright, or some such thing. But if Shakespeare of Stratford wasn't a poet and playwright, and all his neighbors knew it, the monument would be a laughingstock if it dared to claim this in plain English. And so, in fact, it does not. For the learned visitor looking for the memorial to a poet, we create a Latin inscription, vague but flowery, which likens its subject to Nestor, Virgil, and Socrates, and tells us that the earth took him, the people mourn him, and Olympus has him. Nothing specific to Shakespeare, the playwright, for whom Ovid would have been the correct Roman reference, and Sophocles, the playwright, not Socrates, the philosopher, the correct Greek one, but all in all, enough to satisfy those expecting to find him here. But for the local folk, and for Shakespeare's family, who aren't likely to read Latin if they read at all, we need an English inscription that will suit their man. This inscription must not rule out the idea that he could have been a poet, but neither can it state plainly that he was. And of course, if you're Ben Jonson, You'd like it to leave those clever clues for the next generation to unravel. But first, you must get their attention. Stay, passenger! Why goest thou by so fast? Read, if thou canst, whom envious death hath placed within this monument. Shakespeare, with whom quick nature died, since all that he hath writ leaves living art but page to serve his wit. Not much of a tribute to the greatest writer who ever lived. Certainly nothing about plays or poetry, but note those first few lines. It's as much as to say, stop, look, can you read? Do you know whom envious death hath placed within this monument? Shakespeare. Ah, but there's a catch. The body of Will Shakespeare isn't in the monument. It's buried a few yards away under the floor with the famous curse on it, "Cursed be he who moves my bones." The monument is plainly too small to hold anyone's body. And yet, we're asked by the inscription to believe that Shakespeare is within the monument, a monument too small to hold a body. But what if Shakespeare is not a body? What if Shakespeare is a body of works? In the first folio tributes, the works are dedicated to the two earls, saying, quote, "We most humbly consecrate to your highnesses these remains of your servant Shakespeare." Further on, in the folio tributes, Ben Jonson says of the poet, "Thou art a monument without a tomb." And yet further on envisions a day when, quote, "when that stone is rent and time dissolves thy Stratford monument." And further on, every line, each verse, here shall redeem, revive thee from thy hearse. Do we need a further hint? Look above. There we find at the top a jawless skull, envious death, silencing the great poet by interring him, that is, his body, his works, within the monument. And look, on either side, at the top, two angels. One holds a lantern and one a spade. "My name be buried where my body is," the poet tells us in the sonnet. If you need a plainer invitation to dig, I cannot think of one. If the manuscripts are there, they are the greatest buried treasure on the planet. Perhaps they're not there. Perhaps the clues do not mean what they seem to. Or perhaps the papers were removed in the intervening years by those who knew. I, for one, should like to know. A competent stonemason in a few hours' work would solve that mystery. But try convincing the good people of Stratford-on-Avon, home to an enormously lucrative Shakespeare industry. One must love truth a great deal more than gold to take that risk. And so, if we have our man, did Shakespeare. Vero nihil verius, runs the De Vere family motto. Nothing truer than truth. Or as Shakespeare wrote in Measure for Measure, "For truth is truth to the end of reckoning." Or as Edward de Vere wrote under his own name, "For truth is truth, though never so old, and time cannot make that false which once was true." De Vere's personal copy of the Bible survives today. A scholar has recently discovered it contains hundreds of underlined passages in his own hand that correspond to biblical references in the works of Shakespeare. Other passages refer to works done in secret, as an offering to God alone, which will never be known to the world, detachment from the fruits of one's work. As Ben Jonson said, so rightly, the poet's immortal gift to us all. "But stay, I see thee advanced in the heavens, and made a constellation there. Shine forth, thou star of poets." He was not of an age, but for all time.